December 1941. The Pacific exploded into war with the attack on Pearl Harbor, and within weeks, American and Allied troops across the region faced an onslaught unlike anything they had imagined. In the Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, and Singapore, garrisons fought bravely but were overwhelmed by Japanese forces that had prepared for years to expand their empire. Thousands of American soldiers, sailors, and airmen suddenly found themselves in a position for which no training had prepared them, captured, disarmed, and marched away as prisoners of war. They expected difficult conditions, yes, but few could have anticipated the harsh reality of what awaited them in Japanese prison camps. The very first shock came at surrender. In Western tradition, captured soldiers were typically treated with a degree of respect under international law. The Geneva Conventions, recognized by most nations, outlined minimum standards for rations, shelter, and medical care. Many Americans believed their enemy would adhere to similar codes of conduct, but the Japanese military held very different views on captivity. In their culture, influenced by the Bushido Code, surrender was seen as dishonorable, even shameful. To Japanese officers, men who allowed themselves to be captured had forfeited their honor and, by extension, did not deserve the same respect as warriors who fought to the death. This cultural clash set the stage for the treatment that stunned American POW. The fall of Bataan in April 1942 was the first major example. Tens of thousands of American and Filipino troops laid down their arms after months of brutal fighting with little food or ammunition left. Exhausted but relieved that the killing had finally stopped, they expected to be processed into orderly captivity. Instead, they were forced onto what became known as the Bataan Death March. For days they trudged through heat and dust with little food or water, beaten if they fell behind and shocked at the indifference of their captors. Men collapsed on the roadside, and those who could not rise again were left behind. Survivors recalled the disbelief they felt that an army as disciplined as Japan's would treat surrendered soldiers this way. It was a rude awakening to the reality of captivity in the Pacific. Arrival at the prison camps only deepened the shock. The camps themselves were often improvised, thrown together out of old barracks, schoolhouses, or hastily built huts. Sanitation was poor, with latrines overflowing and flies swarming. Food rations were minimal, typically just a bowl of rice or watery soup per day. American soldiers who had once eaten hearty rations of meat, bread, and coffee suddenly found themselves surviving on less than 1,000 calories daily. Malnutrition set in quickly, and men who had been strong and healthy shrank into skeletal figures within months. Yet it was not just the scarcity of food that stunned them. It was the strict regimentation and harsh discipline imposed by the guards. Roll calls could last for hours under the blazing sun, with prisoners forced to stand at attention no matter how weak or ill they felt. Infractions as small as speaking out of turn or failing to bow properly to a Japanese officer brought immediate punishment. For American troops used to a culture of individualism and informality, this rigid control was alien and deeply demoralizing. Letters and diaries that survived tell of the emotional shock as well. Prisoners wrote of their disbelief that such conditions could exist in the modern world. Many clung to the hope that liberation would come quickly, that the war would end within months, and that they would return home soon. But as weeks turned into months, and months into years, the grim reality set in. Survival in the camps would require endurance, ingenuity, and a willpower greater than any battlefield demanded. The Japanese attitude toward POW left little room for mercy, but within the camps, Americans began to adapt. Prisoners formed small groups to share food, trade favors, and look after the sick. Doctors improvised treatments from whatever scraps they could find, using bamboo as splints or boiling leaves for medicine. Such resilience became a point of pride among the captives, even as the conditions shocked them daily. One survivor later wrote, "We went in as soldiers, we became scavengers, survivors, and we learned that survival was victory." By mid-1942, American POW across the Pacific were experiencing variations of this same story. In the Philippines, in Burma, in New Guinea, and in camps scattered from Formosa to Japan itself. Each camp had its own hardships, but the common thread was shock. Shock at the scarcity, shock at the discipline, shock at the realization that captivity under Japan was unlike anything they had imagined. It was not just imprisonment, it was a test of endurance that would last until the very end of the war. Summer 1942. Across the Pacific, the reality of captivity was sinking in for thousands of Americans who had surrendered at Bataan, Corregidor, and other battlefields. What stunned many was not just the deprivation, but the sheer contrast between their expectations and the harsh reality. They had gone into captivity assuming they would be treated as soldiers according to international law. Instead, they were forced into a system that seemed designed to break them both physically and mentally. One of the first shocks was the unpredictability of daily life. At dawn, prisoners were jolted awake by shouted orders and the sound of boots on gravel. Roll calls, called tenkos, dragged on for hours. Guards demanded absolute silence and perfect alignment. Men who wavered or stumbled from exhaustion were struck with rifle butts. For American servicemen used to discipline but also to mutual respect between officers and enlisted, this kind of treatment felt degrading. As one POW later wrote, we were no longer soldiers in their eyes, only bodies to be controlled. Food, or the lack of it, remained the constant struggle. A day's ration might be a single rice ball, a small ladle of watery soup with a few floating greens, or a handful of millet. For men who had once thrived on the hearty rations of the U.S. Army, this was shocking in both quantity and quality. Malnutrition quickly appeared. Beriberi swelled ankles and legs, pellagra ravaged skin, and scurvy loosened teeth. Hunger gnawed constantly, driving men to eat grass, insects, or whatever scraps they could scavenge. German POW later described Allied camps in Europe as harsh but survivable. American POW in the Pacific realized they were in a different world altogether. The camps themselves were crude. Many consisted of little more than bamboo huts or decaying wooden barracks. Roofs leaked during monsoon rains, turning floors into mud pits. In winter, thin clothing offered little protection against the cold winds in northern camps. Sanitation was primitive. Open pits served as latrines, and flies swarmed over everything. Disease spread rapidly in these conditions. Dysentery, malaria, and cholera stalked the camps, claiming countless lives. Yet perhaps the most shocking element was the indifference of the guards. Requests for medicine were often ignored. Prisoners soon realized that they had to rely on their own resourcefulness to survive. Despite the grimness, resilience shone through. American doctors, captured alongside their men, showed extraordinary ingenuity. With no proper medical supplies, they improvised treatments using coconut water as Roman IV fluid, bamboo as splints, and boiled roots as antiseptics. Fellow prisoners risked punishment to smuggle food or tend to the sick. These small acts of defiance, though dangerous, became lifelines. One survivor later remarked, "We had no weapons, no uniforms, but we fought every day to keep each other alive." Another shock was the use of prisoners for forced labor. Many POW were dispatched from camps to work on construction projects, from building airfields to laying railway tracks. In Southeast Asia, Americans found themselves working alongside British, Dutch, and Australian captives on what would become infamous as the Burma-Thailand Railway. For men already weakened by hunger and disease, this labor was brutal. The workday stretched from dawn to dusk, often under the lash of guards. The physical strain and tropical climate combined to create a nightmare of exhaustion. Yet even here, camaraderie sustained them. Prisoners formed small groups, looking out for one another, sharing rations, and helping the weakest through each day. What truly stunned American prisoners was the psychological warfare of captivity. Guards enforced rituals of humiliation, forcing men to bow deeply, shouting insults and punishing infractions arbitrarily. For soldiers trained to fight with dignity, this was an assault on identity. Yet in response, many prisoners developed a quiet defiance. They created makeshift clubs, exchanged jokes, or whispered news gleaned from smuggled radios. These small rebellions reminded them of who they were, not broken captives, but still American servicemen. Above all, what haunted the prisoners was the uncertainty. No one knew how long the war would last. Some clung to rumors of imminent rescue, while others feared they would never leave alive. The psychological strain of waiting, day after day, year after year, was as punishing as hunger or disease. As one POW later reflected, we lived between hope and despair. Each sunrise was a victory, each sunset a reminder we had survived another day. By the end of 1942, American POW across the Pacific had learned the grim truth. Captivity under the Japanese was a battle of endurance. They were stunned by the deprivation, shocked by the treatment, but determined to hold on. Each camp became its own world of suffering and survival, where the fight for dignity was as important as the fight for food. And though the war's end was far from sight, the resilience they discovered in those dark months laid the foundation for survival in the years ahead. By 1943, American prisoners of war had settled into a grim rhythm of survival, though settled was hardly the right word. Life in the camps was unpredictable, harsh, and always on the edge of collapse. What continued to stun many was not just the physical deprivation, but the relentless psychological pressure. Captivity was no longer about a single act of surrender. It became a daily battle of willpower against hunger, fear, and humiliation. The camps varied from place to place, but common patterns emerged. In the Philippines, camps like Cabanatuan and Bilibid became infamous for their overcrowding. Thousands of men were crammed into spaces designed for a fraction of their number. Thin bamboo walls offered little privacy, and prisoners often slept shoulder to shoulder on wooden planks. In Japan itself, POW were shipped across the seas to labor camps near factories, mines, and docks. The men soon discovered that captivity was not a pause in war. It was simply another front line, one where their enemy was not just the guard towers but disease, exhaustion, and despair. The food situation remained dire. Rations, meager from the start, often shrank even further as the Japanese supply system faltered. A prisoner's day might bring little more than a handful of rice, sometimes mixed with barley or millet, occasionally flavored with a scrap of fish or vegetable. For men accustomed to diets rich in meat and bread, this was a shocking deprivation. Weight melted off. In letters smuggled home after the war, families described being unable to recognize their sons in photographs. Muscular young men reduced to gaunt, hollow-eyed survivors. One POW later remarked, "We did not eat to live, we lived to eat. Hunger was all we thought about. Labor became the constant companion of captivity. POW were dispatched to logging camps, railway projects, or mines, where they worked under guard from sunrise to sunset. Those sent to Japan endured what came to be known as the hell ships, or cargo vessels crammed with prisoners transported in suffocating holds, without ventilation, food, or water. Many never survived the journey. For those who did, the shock of arriving in Japan was profound. They had expected camps in remote jungles or islands, but instead found themselves in industrial cities, working side by side with civilian laborers, forging steel or hauling coal. The sheer contrast, being American servicemen forced to power the very war machine they had fought against, was staggering. The brutality of captivity lay not only in physical hardship, but in the daily erosion of identity. Guards demanded constant obedience, often punishing minor infractions with beatings or extra labor. Prisoners were required to bow deeply whenever a Japanese officer passed, a gesture that grated against their pride. Some men resisted quietly, saluting instead of bowing, whispering jokes in defiance, but the risk was always severe. Punishments were swift and public, designed to remind prisoners of their powerlessness. The shock for Americans was profound. Men who had once commanded platoons or flown aircraft now found themselves reduced to numbers on a roster, stripped of rank and dignity. Yet amidst the suffering, resilience persisted. Prisoners developed coping mechanisms to withstand the psychological strain. Secret classes were organized, where men taught each other subjects ranging from mathematics to foreign languages. Hymns and prayers were whispered in the barracks at night, offering comfort to those who feared they would not survive. Hidden radios, when smuggled in, became lifelines of hope, providing snippets of news that the Allies were advancing in the Pacific. Each rumor of victory, whether of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, or New Guinea, lifted spirits, even when conditions in the camp worsened. The camaraderie between prisoners was perhaps the most powerful weapon against despair. Men shared rations, cared for the sick, and sometimes sacrificed their own strength to keep a comrade alive. Doctors continued to improvise treatments, turning scraps of cloth into bandages or carving surgical tools from bamboo. One POW surgeon later recalled, "We had nothing, yet we managed something." Every life saved was an act of defiance. For German POW in America, captivity often meant decent rations, sports, and relative safety. For Americans under Japan, the shock was the opposite: deprivation, humiliation, and forced labor. This contrast, well documented after the war, reinforced the disbelief many felt at their treatment. They had expected hardship. They had not expected a system that seemed to deny their very humanity. By 1943, the realization had set in that liberation was far off. The war showed no sign of ending soon, and rumors swirled of new offensives and setbacks alike. For the prisoners, survival became the only goal. Each day endured was a victory, each week another small triumph. And though they were stunned by the conditions they faced, they also discovered reserves of strength they had never known. Captivity was no longer a test of arms, it was a test of spirit. As 1943 turned into 1944, the war's momentum was shifting in the Pacific. American forces were advancing island by island, pressing ever closer to Japan. Yet for the thousands of American POWs scattered across the empire, liberation still seemed impossibly distant. In their daily reality, the shock of captivity remained constant. Food shortages, punishing labor, disease, and the unrelenting discipline of their guards. But as months stretched into years, another layer of shock emerged. The sheer endurance required to remain human in conditions designed to strip men of their identity. Camps across the Philippines, Formosa, and the Japanese home islands developed their own grim reputations. At Cabanatuan, survivors of the Bataan Death March languished in bamboo huts that sagged under monsoon rains. In Manchuria, bitter winters froze men who lacked coats or shoes. In Japan, camps near industrial centers forced prisoners into coal mines and steel mills where danger lurked in every shaft and furnace. For the Americans, it was not just the physical strain that stunned them, but the realization that captivity had become a war of attrition. Every day tested whether the body or the will would give out first. Food remained at the heart of suffering. By this point, most prisoners had endured 2 years on diets that never provided enough calories. Malnutrition had become a defining feature of camp life. Diseases linked to hunger spread relentlessly. Beriberi swelled bodies, pellagra discolored skin, and night blindness robbed men of their sight. The human form wasted away before their eyes. Men who had once stood strong at over 180 pounds now weighed scarcely 100. One POW, you later wrote, "We watched each other vanish, little by little, until we were shadows of ourselves." The shock lay not only in personal decline, but in witnessing comrades waste away day after day. Labor assignments grew harsher as Japan's war effort faltered. Factories demanded more coal, more steel, more ships, and the prisoners were driven to provide it. American POWs shoveled coal in freezing winters, hauled heavy ore, or worked under the searing blast of furnaces. Exhaustion was constant. Accidents took a steady toll. Yet perhaps the greatest cruelty was psychological. These men knew that their labor directly supported the war machine of the very enemy who had captured them. The irony stunned many. Men who had once carried rifles and defended outposts now spent their strength fueling the enemy's war. Discipline remained merciless. Guards enforced obedience with little tolerance for weakness. Roll calls could last for hours, often stretching deep into the night if numbers did not tally perfectly. Men who faltered during labor details risked beatings or worse. The guards demanded bows and silence, gestures that grated against American pride. The shock of cultural difference lingered. To the Japanese military, surrender stripped men of honor. To the Americans, honor lay in survival, yet both sides failed to understand each other fully. Despite this, resilience became the prisoners' quiet rebellion. In the barracks at night, they whispered stories of home, recited poetry, or shared memories of meals they longed for. Some carved chess sets from scraps of wood, others fashioned makeshift playing cards. These small sparks of normalcy reminded them of life beyond the fences. Secretly, a few camps passed along radio reports, smuggled in at great risk. Each snippet of news, a battle won, an island retaken, rekindled hope. Men stunned by the cruelty of captivity were equally stunned by their own ability to cling to optimism against all odds. American doctors continued their extraordinary efforts. With almost no supplies, they battled disease with ingenuity. They brewed medicinal teas from leaves, made bandages from rags, and even performed surgery with improvised instruments. Though many lives could not be saved, each survival was celebrated as a triumph. These acts of care were powerful reminders that compassion still existed even in the darkest corners of war. By 1944, the prisoners understood one sobering truth. They were engaged in a war of survival measured not in battles but in days endured. The shock they had felt upon capture, disbelief at their treatment, horror at the marches, astonishment at the camps, had not faded. Instead, it evolved into a deeper, quieter shock, that men could endure so much suffering and still remain human. As American forces closed in on the Philippines, rumors of liberation began to spread. Prisoners whispered about approaching battles, clinging to the hope that freedom was near. Yet many also feared what might happen if Japan felt defeat was inevitable. Would the guards release them, or would they face even darker fates? This uncertainty weighed heavily. For men already stunned by years of deprivation, the prospect of what might come next was almost unbearable. By late 1944, the tide of war had shifted unmistakably in the Allies' favor. American carrier groups swept across the Pacific. Island strongholds once thought impregnable had fallen, and Japan's empire was shrinking under relentless pressure. But for the thousands of Americans imprisoned in Japanese camps, the war's changing fortunes brought not immediate relief, but even deeper uncertainty. Their stunned disbelief at the conditions of captivity was now joined by gnawing fears about what the endgame might mean for them. The camps had by this point developed a grim consistency. Prisoners could count on little more than rice, watery soup, and perhaps a rare scrap of fish. Starvation was no longer a looming threat but a daily reality. Malnutrition warped bodies into skeletal forms, and diseases continued unchecked. With Allied bombing campaigns battering Japan's supply lines, rations for both soldiers and prisoners shrank further still. For American POW, the realization was devastating. The closer victory came, the harsher their captivity grew. Labor assignments intensified as Japan's industrial needs became desperate. Prisoners were marched daily into coal mines, shipyards, and steel mills, where they worked alongside civilian laborers under the watchful eyes of guards. The work was dangerous, exhausting, and unrelenting. Collapses in tunnels, burns from furnaces, and accidents on docks took a constant toll. Yet men kept going, driven less by orders than by the instinct to survive. What stunned many was how routine this backbreaking labor became. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into months, until captivity itself felt endless. Even more unsettling was the psychological tension that hovered over the camps. Rumors spread quickly, some fueled by smuggled radios, others by whispered conversations with sympathetic civilians, that American forces were approaching. Some said MacArthur had returned to the Philippines. Others claimed that Tokyo itself was under attack. Each rumor lifted spirits briefly, but also raised questions. What would happen when the Allies arrived? Would the guards abandon the camps? Would they execute the prisoners to prevent their liberation? The uncertainty gnawed at men already stretched to their limits. In this environment, resilience took on new forms. Prisoners became adept at small acts of resistance. Some deliberately slowed their labor, subtly sabotaging machinery or tools. Others found ways to trade with civilians, exchanging handmade trinkets or stolen coal for scraps of food. These risks were great, but they gave men a sense of agency in a life otherwise stripped of control. As one survivor later recalled, a crust of bread, smuggled from a worker in the city, felt like a victory as great as any battle. Faith, too, became a pillar of endurance. Chaplains, though stripped of formal roles, continued to lead whispered prayers. Hymns carried softly through the barracks at night offered comfort and reminded men of home. For some, faith in God sustained them. For others, faith in eventual liberation by their countrymen provided the strength to endure another day. The shock of captivity never disappeared, but it became tempered by an equally powerful determination not to surrender to despair. By this stage of the war, Allied aircraft were a constant presence overhead. Prisoners watched with mixed emotions as bombers roared across the sky. On one hand, the raids were proof that liberation was drawing nearer. On the other, they brought danger. Camps near industrial centers shook under the explosions, and several were hit accidentally. Prisoners huddled in shelters, praying that the bombs meant for factories would not fall on their fragile huts. The duality was staggering. The very planes that symbolized freedom could just as easily mean death. Letters from home, when they arrived at all, carried an almost unbearable weight. Many prisoners had gone months, even years, without word from their families. When a letter slipped through, it was read and reread until the paper nearly disintegrated. These scraps of connection stunned the men with reminders of what they had lost, but also gave them hope for what they might one day regain. For the guards, too, tension grew. Some became harsher, fearful of Allied advances, determined to maintain absolute control. Others showed unexpected leniency, perhaps sensing the war's end was near and hoping to avoid post-war retribution. Prisoners noted these shifts with wary eyes. The relationship between captor and captive had always been fraught, but in 1944 it grew even more unpredictable. By year's end, the prisoners understood one truth. Their survival was not guaranteed until the war itself was over. They had been stunned by their capture, shocked by their treatment, and worn down by years of hunger and labor. Yet the resilience they had forged was astonishing. They had adapted, resisted in small ways, and kept hope alive despite the crushing weight of captivity. The war was entering its final, most violent stage, and for the Americans behind the wire, the question was no longer if they would be liberated, but whether they could endure long enough to see that liberation arrive. By early 1945, the Pacific War was reaching its most violent climax. American forces had stormed ashore at Leyte and Luzon, fulfilling General MacArthur's promise to return to the Philippines. Carrier task forces prowled the seas, and B-29 bombers hammered Japan's industrial cities. Liberation was finally in sight for the prisoners of war. But for the Americans still behind barbed wire, each passing day brought both hope and terror. The stunned disbelief they had lived with since capture now shifted into a new form. Astonishment at the uncertainty of what the war's ending might mean for them. For those imprisoned in the Philippines, the thunder of artillery grew closer with every week. At Cabanatuan, where thousands of survivors of the Bataan Death March had languished for nearly 3 years, rumors swirled that the Japanese intended to execute the prisoners before the Americans could free them. The fear was palpable. Men who had already endured starvation and disease now faced the horrifying possibility that their long struggle for survival might end in violence at the very moment rescue seemed near. In Japan itself, prisoners heard the distant rumble of bombs as American air raids became relentless. The sky over Tokyo and Osaka glowed with firestorms that lit the horizon. POW who had once cheered the sight of American bombers now feared them as well, knowing their fragile camps often stood near factories and rail yards. Several camps were hit during these raids, killing prisoners who had endured years of suffering only to fall in the war's final months. The cruel irony stunned survivors, who could only shake their heads at the randomness of survival. Food, already scarce, dwindled further as Japan's supply lines collapsed. The Japanese population itself faced shortages, and POW, always at the bottom of the priority list, felt the deprivation most severely. Men scavenged weeds, boiled grass, and chewed on leather straps to quiet their stomachs. Malnutrition became so advanced that men struggled to walk, their legs swollen with edema, their bodies little more than bones beneath thin skin. Yet still, against all odds, many clung to life. One prisoner later wrote, "We survived on willpower as much as on food. Hunger became part of us, but so did hope." The guards, too, were caught in this shifting tide. Some grew harsher, their discipline fueled by fear and frustration as defeat loomed. Punishments became more erratic, roll calls longer, and labor even more punishing. Others, however, softened, treating prisoners with a degree of humanity previously unseen. Perhaps they feared retribution after the war. Perhaps the strain of endless conflict wore down their own resolve. For the Americans, this inconsistency was stunning. After years of cruelty, small acts of kindness, an extra ladle of soup, a guard turning a blind eye to trading with civilians, seemed almost unreal. Psychologically, the strain was immense. The prisoners had endured years of suffering, and the constant uncertainty now weighed heavier than ever. Liberation felt close, but no one knew when it would come or in what form. Would the Americans storm the gates in triumph, or would prisoners be marched into the jungle and executed before help arrived? Each day of waiting stretched nerves to the breaking point. Men whispered prayers, clung to routines, and reminded each other that survival meant holding on just a little longer. In January 1945, hope arrived for some. The famous raid at Cabanatuan saw American Rangers, aided by Filipino guerrillas, slip behind enemy lines and liberate more than 500 prisoners. The stunned survivors, weak and emaciated, wept as they were carried to safety. For them, the nightmare had ended, but for thousands of others still scattered across Japan and its occupied territories, captivity continued. Meanwhile, Allied victories spread rapidly across the Pacific. From Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the news tightened around Japan. Prisoners caught glimpses of these developments in smuggled newspapers or whispers from sympathetic civilians. Every scrap of news became a lifeline. Men who could barely stand erupted with joy at the mention of an island retaken, a Japanese fleet destroyed, or an Allied landing completed. It was a reminder that, however distant liberation seemed, the tide of history was turning in their favor. By mid-1945, the Americans behind barbed wire had endured nearly 4 years of captivity. They had been stunned at every stage, by their capture, by the brutality of marches and camps, by the relentless hunger and labor, and now by the uncertainty of what final chapter awaited them. Yet even in their weakest moments, they discovered resilience they never thought possible. One survivor summed it up years later: "We did not know our strength until we had no choice but to use it." Summer 1945. Japan's empire, once vast and seemingly unstoppable, was collapsing under the weight of Allied power. The skies thundered daily with American bombers, and the seas churned with fleets that moved wherever they pleased. Yet behind barbed wire in camps across the Pacific, thousands of American prisoners remained trapped in limbo. For them, the final months of the war were filled with stunning contrasts: hope and fear, anticipation and despair, relief and tragedy. In camps throughout the Japanese home islands, the rumble of B-29 bombers had become a constant presence. The men watched from behind fences as squadrons streaked overhead, trailing contrails across the sky. They cheered quietly at each raid, knowing it meant their country was closing in, but the raids also filled them with dread. More than once, bombs fell perilously close to barracks. In some cases, camps situated near industrial targets were struck directly. For the men who had survived years of hunger and labor, the possibility of dying in a final air raid was a cruel twist. One survivor later wrote, "We prayed for the bombs to fall, but not on us." Meanwhile, in Manchuria and Southeast Asia, POW faced a different fear. Rumors spread that the Japanese might massacre prisoners rather than allow them to be liberated. Guards grew more erratic, their behavior unpredictable as Japan's defeats mounted. Some seemed resigned, while others clung to discipline with renewed harshness. Prisoners whispered to each other in the barracks. Would they live to see freedom, or would their lives be extinguished in the war's closing hours? The uncertainty was stunning, gnawing at morale more deeply than hunger or disease ever had. Despite the fear, small signs of hope appeared. Allied planes began dropping leaflets, some warning civilians of upcoming bombings, others carrying news of Allied advances. A few even made it into the hands of prisoners, who treasured them as proof that liberation was near. Secret radios, when they functioned, confirmed what the men desperately wanted to believe: the end was coming. Okinawa had fallen, and American bombers now roamed freely over Japan. For the POW, these updates were like oxygen, keeping their spirits alive through the darkest nights. Food supplies, however, hit rock bottom. Japan's own population was starving, and prisoners were often given little more than scraps. Malnutrition reached catastrophic levels. Men who had once weighed close to 200 pounds now weighed scarcely 90. Bodies swelled with edema, skin broke down from vitamin deficiencies, and weakness became so profound that some could no longer stand during roll call. And yet, even in such dire circumstances, many clung to life with sheer willpower. One survivor remembered telling himself each morning, "Just make it through today. Tomorrow might be the day." In the Philippines, the story was different. As American forces swept northward, they liberated camp after camp, finding emaciated men who wept with joy at the sight of their countrymen. In some cases, daring rescue raids snatched prisoners from certain death. These operations stunned the world, showcasing the determination of the Allies not to abandon their own. The men who were freed described the shock of eating proper food again, of seeing healthy soldiers, of realizing that their ordeal was finally over. But for those still in camps in Japan and elsewhere, the waiting game stretched on. The dropping of the atomic bombs in August brought the war to its shocking climax, though the prisoners did not know it at first. They only sensed a shift in their captors' behavior. Roll calls became less strict. Guards seemed distracted, nervous, uncertain. Then one day the orders stopped coming. The men were left stunned, hardly daring to believe what was unfolding. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. Yet liberation was not immediate. Weeks passed before Allied forces reached many camps. During that limbo, prisoners survived on dwindling rations, waiting anxiously for confirmation. Finally, in late August and early September, aircraft appeared overhead, not with bombs, but with parachutes carrying food and supplies. For men who had lived on little more than rice for years, the sight of crates filled with chocolate, canned meat, and cigarettes was overwhelming. Some cried as they ate, others laughed uncontrollably. The shock of sudden abundance after years of starvation was almost too much to process. The Americans had endured unimaginable hardships. They had been stunned by every stage of their captivity: the marches, the camps, the starvation, the labor, the uncertainty. And now, in the war's closing days, they were stunned once more, this time not by cruelty, but by the sheer joy of survival and the realization that freedom had finally returned. September 1945. The war was over. Japan had surrendered, the guns had fallen silent, and the world was beginning to comprehend the scale of the conflict that had consumed it. For American prisoners of war, liberation was not a single moment of triumph, but a surreal process of awakening from years of deprivation. They were stunned, not just by the fact that they had survived, but by the sheer transformation that came with freedom. The first sign of liberation for many prisoners was the sudden arrival of Allied aircraft overhead. Instead of bombs, parachutes blossomed in the sky, carrying crates packed with food, medicine, and supplies. The sight was overwhelming. Men who had lived on thin bowls of rice now feasted on canned meat, chocolate, and cigarettes. Some cried uncontrollably as they bit into their first real meal in years. Others laughed until tears streamed down their faces. A few grew ill from overeating, their bodies too frail to handle abundance after prolonged starvation. Still, the emotional release was indescribable. As one survivor recalled, it was as though a nightmare had ended in the blink of an eye. We could hardly believe it was real. When Allied forces finally reached the camps, the reactions were electric. Emaciated men, little more than skin and bone, rushed to embrace soldiers who had come to free them. Many could barely stand, yet they summoned every ounce of strength to salute or shake hands. For the liberators, the sight was equally shocking. Hardened combat veterans wept openly as they took in the condition of the prisoners. One American officer later wrote, "We expected hardship. We did not expect to see our men reduced to skeletons." Medical teams immediately began treating the former captives. Doctors and nurses were horrified at the state of malnutrition, disease, and untreated wounds. Hospitals were set up quickly, and men who had gone without care for years finally received proper treatment. The contrast stunned the prisoners themselves. They had grown so used to suffering that basic medical care felt miraculous. A simple vitamin, an injection could restore energy, and clean bandages seemed like luxuries beyond imagination. Clothing and grooming also became powerful symbols of liberation. Prisoners who had worn rags for years were issued fresh uniforms. Hair and beards were trimmed, and for the first time in ages, men saw themselves in mirrors. Many were shocked by their own reflections, gaunt faces, sunken eyes, bodies stripped of muscle. Some broke down, realizing how much they had changed. Yet the uniform, crisp and clean, was a reminder that they were soldiers again, not captives. The return to food and comfort carried its own emotional weight. Cigarettes, chocolate bars, and coffee, simple pleasures, were savored as treasures. Meals became communal celebrations. Men toasted their survival with canned milk or shared candy like sacred offerings. The shock of abundance was almost as overwhelming as the shock of deprivation had once been. Liberation was not only freedom from captivity, but the rediscovery of normal life piece by piece. Reunion with comrades was equally moving. Men who had been scattered across different camps began to find each other again. Tears flowed freely as friends embraced, often stunned to discover that the other had survived. In some cases, survivors received news that comrades or brothers had perished, a reminder that freedom carried both joy and sorrow. Yet liberation also brought a sobering realization. For years, the prisoners had focused only on survival, making it through one more day, one more week. Now, with the war over, they were confronted with the enormity of what they had endured. Many were stunned by the weight of memory, by the stories etched into their minds, by the losses they had witnessed. Survival was triumph, but it was also a burden. As they boarded ships and planes for the long journey home, the former prisoners felt a mix of emotions: relief, gratitude, grief, and disbelief. Some stood silently on deck as the coastline of Japan faded behind them, wondering how they had survived what seemed impossible. Others dreamed of reunions with families they had not seen in years. They were free, yet forever changed. For American POW, the end of the war was not just liberation from captivity, it was proof of endurance beyond imagination. They had been stunned at every stage of their imprisonment, by capture, by the marches, by the camps, by hunger, and by the uncertainty of survival. And now at last they were stunned once more, by freedom, by abundance, and by the realization that they had endured the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. The war was over, but for American prisoners of war, the journey did not end with liberation. Returning home brought its own kind of shock, one that was quieter but no less profound. After years of captivity in Japanese prison camps, men who stepped off transport ships onto American soil were greeted as heroes. Bands played, crowds cheered, families wept with joy. Yet beneath the celebrations, each man carried memories that would never leave him. The physical recovery was the most immediate challenge. Doctors who examined returning POW were stunned at their condition. Many weighed less than 100 pounds, their bodies ravaged by malnutrition and disease. Muscles had wasted away, teeth had fallen out, and old wounds had gone untreated for years. Hospitals across the United States filled with former prisoners who needed weeks, months, even years of medical care. Vitamins, protein, rich meals, and rest began to restore them, but scars, both visible and invisible, remained. Families, too, were shocked at the changes. Wives, parents, and children who had waited for years sometimes struggled to recognize the gaunt figures who returned to them. Reunions were emotional and overwhelming. Some embraced with tears of joy, others stood silently, trying to reconcile memory with reality. For the families, the war had been years of anxious waiting. For the survivors, it had been a daily battle against hunger, fear, and despair. Coming together again was joyous, but also complicated. The emotional adjustment proved just as difficult as the physical. Prisoners who had lived for survival now had to learn how to live in peace again. Nightmares haunted their sleep. The sound of boots on pavement or the smell of smoke could trigger memories of the camps. Some men found it hard to explain what they had endured, falling silent when asked about their experiences. Others spoke openly, determined that the world should know what captivity under Japan had meant. Either way, the memories were inescapable. In the years after the war, testimony from American POW helped shape global understanding of wartime atrocities. Their stories shocked audiences who had never imagined such conditions. Newspapers published accounts of starvation, forced labor, and cruelty. Trials were held for camp commanders and guards accused of mistreatment, with many convicted for their actions. The voices of former prisoners became part of the historical record, ensuring that their suffering was not forgotten. Yet amid the pain, resilience shone through. Many former POW built new lives, raising families, pursuing careers, and contributing to their communities. They carried the lessons of survival with them, the value of camaraderie, the strength of endurance, the importance of hope. Some even turned their experiences into advocacy, pushing for better treatment of prisoners in future conflicts. Their stories became reminders of both the depths of human cruelty and the heights of human courage. For the men themselves, liberation was both an ending and a beginning. The end of years of deprivation, but the beginning of a lifelong journey to reconcile with what they had endured. They had been stunned at every stage, by capture, by hunger, by labor, by uncertainty, by liberation. And now they were stunned again by the challenge of rebuilding their lives in a world that had moved forward without them. Looking back, many survivors framed their ordeal not just as tragedy, but as testimony to the power of the human spirit. They had been pushed beyond the limits of endurance, yet they had survived. As one veteran reflected decades later, we lost much, but we kept our dignity. We proved that even in the darkest places, hope can endure. The legacy of their experience endures as well. Museums, memorials, and books keep alive the memory of what American POW endured in Japanese prison camps. Their story is one of suffering, but also of resilience, a reminder that history is not only written in battles won and lost, but in the endurance of those who survived captivity against impossible odds. In the end, the shock of captivity gave way to the astonishment of survival. For the American POW, their journey through Japanese prison camps was a chapter of history that revealed both the cruelty of war and the strength of the human will. And though many remained haunted by their memories, they also knew one truth above all. They had endured, they had returned, and their story would never be forgotten.